afternoon, everyone. I'm Theron Makley, and I'll be your host tonight for our CRES monthly event. I have John Witchell, who is assisting me with the chat and the questions, and we have LaDale Winling with us, who will be our presenter tonight. First, before the presentation, I'm going to go through our standard CRES intro and do the housekeeping events. So this is the Denver chapter of CRES. There's several chapters around the state, and we're the one focused on Metro Denver. So the MD is Metro Denver. Our goal is to support 100% renewable Colorado through education, engagement, and connection to networking opportunities. So that's hopefully while you're here, and we're always looking to engage more people in our mission here. We value our renewables, emerging technologies, efficiency, diversity, inclusion, and community. And tonight, we're going to be looking at those last three because we don't usually hit those. You know, we tend to focus on technology and promoting new technologies or new ways, novel ways of using technology. We're going to work on the people aspect tonight and talk about some history around what has affected the forming of our existing power structures. So our standard format, I'm going to go through a few announcements, talk to you about some legislation and some current events, and then we'll turn it over to LaDale, and he'll take over for about 45 minutes to 50 minutes. Then we'll open up for questioning, and we're prepared to go questioning like we normally do. We try to take as many questions as possible, and we could go up to 7:30. It depends on our audience and how many questions you have. So we always like to get more members. Please go to our website if you're interested in joining. It's fun, but we've had remote fun on Zoom and on GoToWebinar for the last 18 months or so. So we're hoping to get back to in-person. We originally thought this would be our first in-person event, but because of the resurgence, we're not able to do that. And it looks like right now our September event is also going to be on GoToWebinar. Any feedback you have for us tonight, please email us. If you could jot this down real quick. We're always interested in your feedback. Any comments on our presentation material, the way we conduct these, ways we could do a better job of serving you, open to all comments. And we're always looking for donations to support this. We're an all-volunteer organization. We're a 501c3. We only work on donations. We have a few corporate sponsors, but in general, we work off the yearly dues and off of the generosity of our members. So this year, as far as membership goes, you can get a 25% discount because this is our 25th anniversary. And you can use the code CRES25, C-R-E-S in all caps, when you check out. So you might want to jot that down as well. So getting into the legislative side of things, if you're not following the federal news, the Senate passed the start of the $1 trillion infrastructure bill last week. Now that has a lot of ways to go. It has to go to the House and get reformatted, come back to the Senate, but at least we know that's starting to work. When this passes, it's going to be a great opportunity for our industry and hopefully everyone on this call. We've been waiting for this for a long time. Anything you can do to contact your representatives or senators would be much appreciated. Next, in local news, the city has just published RFP for work development to produce green new jobs. They're also looking for a person to staff that, but they're looking for 10 workforce opportunities. So if you or your company has ideas or projects where you're actually going to be hiring in the Denver area, please take a look at that and support that. We'll get that link out to you. John's going to be relaying some links here as we go. And if you have any questions, you can use that email too to get more specifics from us. Here's the job opportunities currently coming up. So the city is looking for a building decarbonization incentives manager, and the the Utilities Commission is looking to expand its staff. So this is a great opportunity both for individuals who have this expertise and want to look at this. It's also a great opportunity for us to get CRES members on the PUC advisory and help us to promote policy that's friendly. So this is a great thing in the new legislature where we're expanding our PUC outreach and influence. Next month, we'll be featuring our annual policy panel. We're going to have Senator Chris Hansen and Representative Tracy Bennett. Tracy Bennett is a newer state representative, and she was the author of several great bills this last session. So we're looking forward to that. It's one of our most popular events in the year, so make sure you get that on your calendar. Spread the word on that too. Please invite people far and wide because it's a very informative session. And tonight's event is going to be Mapping Inequality, Redlining and Climate Change. And this presentation is going to explore correlations between mid-20th century redlining and environmental and health equities today, or inequities today, as a way of documenting and understanding the relationship between racist 20th century federal policies and contemporary inequalities. It will focus particular attention on Denver. I want to explain this a little bit in that this is a little out of our ballpark, like I talked before. It's not something we normally would. It might be uncomfortable for some people, but the steering committee feels like as a group was promoting new technology and new ways of doing business, we need to understand history and what has happened in the past that may have created bad systems or systems that have oppressed people or not treated people equitably. So we want to introduce this to you as a background and hopefully influence our society here in Denver. Plus, it's some very interesting data that's specific to Denver. We have LaDale Winling. He's Associate Professor of History and core member of the Public History program at Virginia Tech. His research and teaching explore urban and political history in the United States, especially how space, architecture, and geography shape politics, economic life, and daily experience. His book, Finding the Ivory Tower, examined the role of American universities as real estate developers in the 20th century. He uses spatial data tools in both his print and digital work over the web, which you'll be able to see tonight. With collaborators in 2016, he launched this report that he's going to be talking about today. So LaDale, I'll make you a presenter and you can take over until you're finished, and then John and I will come back after that to run a question and answer session.
Great, thank you so much.
Welcome. There you go.
So I've got, let's see, show my screen. I'm going to say not yet, so you can look at me for a second. And so I'm a professor of history at Virginia Tech, and I study U.S. urban history. And one of the key kind of questions that urban historians, especially ones focusing on the 20th century in the United States, investigate is these kind of patterns of racial inequality in American cities, and how the patterns of suburbanization in some ways left like suburbs wealthy and central cities, especially residential neighborhoods in center cities, kind of disinvested and impoverished. And there's a key set of programs, or a key set of patterns that historians have discovered and explained, and there's one that I want to talk about this evening, and it has to do with home finance and real estate. You've, I'm sure, heard this term redlining. It's used, quite frequently journalistically, we see it. I have Google alerts, which tell me like there's, like up to a dozen articles written across the country every single day on the issue of redlining. And urban historians have, we'll say, like found or discovered or really rediscovered a set of programs that were envisioned by the private sector, real estate professionals, economists in the 1920s, and that were incorporated in public policy, federal legislation in the 1930s as a result, kind of a response to the Great Depression. And it fundamentally restructured both like the real estate and home finance sectors. And then because of those subsidies, because of those appropriations, and because of those broader policies and practices, helped shape patterns of inequality in American cities, right? And so let's see, you are now looking at my screen. Are you looking at a big map of the United States with a lot of cities highlighted?
We see that.
Great. So the term redlining comes from a series of programs that were created by first the Hoover administration and then the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression, right? So to cast your minds way back, in 1933, there were like thousands of bank failures. For example, 1933 was kind of the lowest point in the Depression. And not only was the problem banks, but it was also like buildings and loans, mortgage companies, and homeowners. So it's estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of all homes with mortgages in the United States in the early 1930s were in default, right? Like 1/3, maybe 1/2. And so coming out of the first 100 days, this kind of like period of like rapid response by the Roosevelt administration, they passed the Homeowners Loan Act, which created the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And what that did was it was a federal agency that was meant to kind of solve the crisis, the financial crisis and the housing crisis of the Great Depression. And it did so with appropriations of like $3 billion, which are akin to like $60–80 billion today, like a major program. And then it refinanced 1 million homes across the country. Basically 1/5 of all homes with mortgages in the US were refinanced through the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And just after that, the federal government passed the National Housing Act, which created the Federal Housing Administration. FHA still exists today. And it's like the intention or the idea was to restructure home finance and real estate so that there would be greater stability and there would never be the same kind of crisis, financial crisis and economic crisis, of the Great Depression. So HOLC is an emergency kind of rescue agency, and FHA is meant to kind of fundamentally restructure. And this is, like I said, kind of a rapid response of the Roosevelt administration, especially. And it's not that there were, like when you pass something quick, it's like legislators are not, sitting on their hands just thinking big thoughts, and they're not able to kind of conceive of these programs fully. What they do is they draw upon ideas that have been developed and advanced by think tanks and lobbyists, or in this case, a set of academics as well as real estate professionals. The National Association of Real Estate Boards, which is the predecessor to the National Association of Realtors, which still exists to this day, who had been advocating for long-term mortgages. In the 1930s, typical mortgages were 3, 5, maybe 7 years long, and they were kind of like balloon payments at the end. So you would not pay down principal all the way, and that kind of helped contribute to this crisis in the Great Depression, because basically once one bank fails or a bank calls its loan, then you can't get, you as a home buyer or homeowner who has a loan or mortgage, you can't get a new mortgage to kind of pay off your old one, or like you've lost your job and you have not kind of built up equity over time. And so the idea was to create a long-term, fully amortized mortgage, which started out with Hulk of 15 years. And that was like kind of the first time that that had been available or used. And then it was extended to 25 years. And so it started with Hulk, and then it was adopted by FHA. And these came, as I said, from a set of economists who worked at Northwestern University. There was a real estate research institute there, and NARA, the National Association of Real Estate Boards. And so with this long-term mortgage, and that the federal government was really the only lender available across the country. If you think of one of my favorite films, It's a Wonderful Life, there's this scene where George Bailey, he's like just gotten married and he swings by the building and loan, and there's a run on the bank, and they come over to the building and loan as well, and they say, we want our money. And he says, oh, it's not in, like, we don't have the money here, it's in your house and your neighbor's house. And these are kind of like long-term commitments that people want to liquidate immediately. And building and loans were really much more prominent than mortgage companies. Buildings and loans, they eventually became known as savings and loans. And so by 1940, I'll say, there's census data which ask people, where do you have your mortgage from? The number one lender of all mortgages in the country was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, because they had, like I said, refinanced so many to help keep homeowners in their homes, and also to clear the balance sheets of mortgage companies, building and loans, and so forth. And so since the Homeowners Loan Corporation was going to be on the hook, like they had committed billions of dollars to refinance, at that point there was no national real estate clearinghouse of information, right? There were a lot of like local real estate networks of information, but there was no national source. And so, a couple economists and appraisers and policy types who had jobs at the Homeowners Loan Corporation and FHA said, we should create a survey. We should create that like database, or that information clearinghouse, by sending surveys to lenders and realtors and appraisers all across the country. And so what they did was, in order to build that kind of like analog database, they sent these questionnaires. Basically, they said, where are the good neighborhoods in your city? Where are the bad neighborhoods? And like, what makes them a good neighborhood? What makes them a bad neighborhood? How much is rental? How much is apartments for rent? How much is houses for purchase? And like, what do they go for? And so it was a massive undertaking. It was actually, I call it the nation's first kind of like spatial big data project. It was actually bigger than the US Census, not in its overall data for individuals, but basically by neighborhood. The US Census in the 1930s, and in 1930, had about 18 to 20 cities that were separated by neighborhood, where you could say, like, what does North Chicago look like, or what does South Chicago look like, or what do these neighborhoods have in terms of demographics, in terms of income, in terms of foreign born, et cetera, et cetera. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation, with this survey, sent them to cities of population 40,000 or more. So it was more than 200 cities. Like I said, it was like the largest kind of undertaking like this, right? So an example I give out of the city of Chicago, is this the one that I want? Is these are kind of some of these documents, which still exist in the National Archives, right? They're federal documents, and so they were saved. And it basically asks you, like, what's the name of this, like, city or area? What's the population? Is it increasing or decreasing or staying the same, static? You can see here. What are the class of people there? This neighborhood is laborers, many of whom are on relief, like WPA programs and so forth. And it asks what percentage of foreign-born families and what nationalities, what percent African Americans. And this neighborhood on the south side of Chicago is 100% African American, right? Asks about rental rates, it asks about home ownership rates and so forth. And then it also, they ask these realtors and appraisers, like, tell us more in qualitative terms what these neighborhoods are like. This one on the south side, which I'll show you on the map in a second, says, you know, like, you can read it here in type or the kind of image here, located between 35th and 67th, the west side of Cottage Grove to State, that's the kind of boundaries, is 100% Negro, predominantly apartment buildings, 3 flats, 6 flats, and up, and a few 2 flats, you know, buildings with 2 apartments in it. Here you can see in the TypeScript part, with few exceptions, the district is blighted and without financing, but values and rents have increased about 30% since 1935. People are primarily employed as laborers. Very large numbers are on relief. And then it also says that, let's see, this entire section will ultimately go colored, which will increase the number of colored people using the lakefront. This is just, you know, like a dozen or 2 dozen blocks from Lake Michigan. Washington Park is already doomed. Throughout the entire area are many vacant lots for which there's no market, due in part to the class of inhabitants. And, you know, here it says here a better class of colored people reside. And so they're talking about both the kind of character of the buildings, like its broad geography, access to transportation and so forth, but also fundamentally about the demographics of the neighborhood. And this is in part because of those economists that I mentioned. Let's see here, let's close that up. Those economists with a long-term loan, they advocated for a long-term loan or a long-term mortgage, and they fundamentally believed, they developed economic theories which said that if you have a long-term loan, you need long-term stability in the housing quality as well as in the population. And these economists and like real estate leaders also fundamentally believed that African Americans were not good workers, were not like stable mortgage payers, were not stable employees, and that they believe that whites would not accept living in like mixed neighborhoods with African Americans, with Mexican Americans, or even for a certain to some extent with like European immigrants. And so what they said, I mean, we know that there was a good deal of racism and kind of ethnic tension and hatred in American cities in this area, and about that there is no, you know, question. But these economists turned this into fundamental economic theory by, you know, internalizing some of their own biases, as well as operating on some of the racism that they saw about them. They said this is a fundamental law of land economics. And then these were the ideas that went into the creation of the policy of the Homeowners Loan Corporation and FHA. So we have here at this site, which you can kind of explore a little bit on your own time if you're interested in mapping inequality, we have maps and these area descriptions, these forms, these survey kind of collated or distilled survey information, from these like cities over 40,000. So that of course includes Denver, right? And so we've seen like this term redlining comes from these neighborhoods which are color coded red. And there's 4 grades given by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which are what you see here, right? Green, A, are best, right? Like hotspots, desirable, usually white professional class residents, and these are full of low density homes, low density single family residences. The blue areas are still desirable. You know, like they once were the most desirable. Some changes, maybe the neighborhood is all built out. It's not quite as low density, but it's still a very good risk. And that's in part because of the stability of the population. It's not going to change anytime soon. And thus there's not going to be kind of a process of like white flight. And the yellow definitely declining, or C neighborhoods, and you can see these highlighted for Denver, characterized by obsolescence. The buildings are old, maybe they need updated, you know, fixtures, plumbing, utilities, and so forth. An infiltration of a lower grade population, like basically African Americans, Jews, and European immigrants have moved into these neighborhoods and areas. And so as a result, in their minds, prices have dropped. And, you know, basically if you make a long-term mortgage, you're not going to get a profit, and the eventual, the seller, like the borrower, when he or she sells, is not going to be able to get his or her money back. And so you, the lender, are going to lose, right? And then D, these redlined neighborhoods, hazardous, characterized by detrimental influences, undesirable population, and an infiltration. They say lenders should not make loans in there. And they basically say all the things that we worried about would happen in the blue B neighborhoods, and we saw happening in the yellow or C neighborhoods, the declining neighborhoods, they've already happened in the hazardous or redlined neighborhoods. So let me show you how some of this like kind of plays out in Denver. You can see, so let's see, show the map, right? So kind of North Denver here, not too far north. This is a better Negro section of Denver and one of the best colored districts in the United States. Northeastern part, often referred to as the Negro Country Club. For a Negro section, it is very well kept up. Were it not for the heavy colored population, much of it could be rated C. But some African Americans can obtain loans from institutions like building and loans, like banks and so forth. Others are victims of industrial operators who have high fees and high interest rates, right? And so what happens over the course of like the 20th century is that in these neighborhoods, which have been defined as hazardous, even if there's like a middle class Black population, or even if there's like kind of a prosperous Jewish neighborhood, they see disinvestment. There's the withholding or the denial of mortgages, or for FHA, mortgage guarantees. And then we also see a process by which, like this kind of redlining and the work of FHA, then FHA teaches appraisers, how do you value a home? How do you determine its value? And by this process, the economists from the 1920s, like basically their staff and their students, went to work for FHA and Holk, set the policies, and then taught private appraisers, private lenders, and in negotiation with them, basically changed private practice. And they would say like, hey, you don't have to do this, but you're not getting a loan from us. And of course, in the 1930s and really into the 1940s until the end of World War II, there were no other significant sources of capital or lending. So any appraiser that wanted to practice his work, any real estate developer or real estate broker had to follow those kinds of rules. And so by that process of kind of interaction and with the private sector, the public sector, and then kind of working and shaping private practice and resetting the rules of the road, reshaped the housing sector, home finance, and so forth. And one of the ways that they did this was through something you've probably also heard about, which is racially restrictive covenants. This is a set of documents which says it runs with your house, it runs with the land and the deed. It says normally some version that this house or this lot and property may never be leased, owned, sold to, or occupied by anyone not of the Caucasian race. In some cases it says anyone of the Negro race. And it's quite explicit. These often last for 20, 25, 45, 50 years, something along these lines. And this was a way that the federal government, they wanted these kind of racially restrictive covenants because that would provide that stability, that there would be no African Americans, that there would be no Jews, that there would be no immigrants living in these neighborhoods and endangering their values as they saw it, or endangering their loans. I should say it was not true. Like basically when African Americans moved in, prices raised because African Americans in the course of the Great Migration, when they moved to places like Chicago, like Philadelphia, like Denver, they were so desperate for housing, they would pay more than kind of comparable whites to get this limited housing that was open to them, or to like break into a neighborhood. So in fact, African Americans moving in usually raised prices. So we have this kind of like transformation, you know, as you know, I'm sure you've all, you know, kind of dealt with real estate in some fashion. And we know that local property values are the source in many cases, or a large part of local taxes, property taxes, which fund local education districts, right? And are responsible for the revenue that goes into new buildings and infrastructure in school districts, for example, that provides the budget that can provide for you know, teacher pay and like the desirability of teaching jobs in these local school districts. So the fact that a East Side neighborhood has like been greenlined and is like given the green light for federal financing as well as to lenders for investment, helps drive up or maintain already high real estate prices, which then provides more property taxes for the local school districts. While in these like redline neighborhoods, there's kind of this pressure downwards on real estate prices, which leads to lower property taxes and lower kind of revenue. We see this within right now, I'm kind of looking within the city of Denver. There are a couple, you know, like suburban neighborhoods, but we definitely see as a result, both of redlining and other federal policies, that what happens is development is subsidized in somewhat exclusionary suburbs. And so while we could say like, okay, one neighborhood versus another is not so significant, within the city of Denver, even though we do see some disparities, like suburbs have far greater resources, are increasingly exclusionary over the course of the 20th century, and the kind of make a greater spread of these disparities by keeping out African Americans, immigrants, working class, and keeping like even access and the development of multifamily housing, apartments, out of exclusive suburbs, right? So what we can see is that there's kind of like knock-on effects. I say that my grandfather, who was a World War II veteran, after that he came back to the US, he lived in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He bought a house in 1950 and he lived in that house his entire life until he died in 2014, right? 64 years in one house. And so while the idea of a long-term mortgage is like stability, actually accessibility by bringing down individual monthly payments, it also kind of locks in some of these neighborhood effects. So, right, like 2 generations later from this like kind of post-war home purchase, the neighborhood is still anchored by people like my grandfather, right? That's one example, but I'm sure you've seen, you can think of other examples where people stayed in not just the length of their mortgage for 30 years, but then they've kind of like planted roots in their community. They have these kind of relationships and they don't want to move, right? And so it's not just that these effects go for the length of the mortgage, it's that they can go for, in fact, much longer, like up to a half century. And that's in some ways how we get from, say, the 1930s and the 1940s to, today, or certainly into the 21st century. The point is that with real estate and these kind of investments in housing, we see long-term enduring effects. What do these kinds of inequalities have to do with, right, kind of climate change or environmental hazard or public health? And what we've seen, I would say that the redlining maps are, in some ways the Rosetta Stone of American cities. You would not say that any individual like home or any individual mortgage was like rejected because of a redlining map. But when we look at these kinds of examples of public policy, it helps illustrate, it's kind of a guide for things that happened later. We've been able to illustrate, for example, that interstate highways, for example, most frequently went through kind of trails of redlined neighborhoods. The concentration of poverty in, for example, public housing happened in redlined neighborhoods in order to protect the kind of low density professional class green line neighborhoods. And with something like, you've got the demolition and displacement of, they'll say the development of the interstate, but then we also have kind of knock-on air quality effects where, right, in the era of leaded gasoline, we have like lead particles up into the air, and then that affects, right, the kind of health of people living in proximity of these interstates, as an example of a subsequent program or set of programs that go on after this period of redlining. So it can help us kind of understand a number of the moves that went on subsequently. But I would say a number of like climate scientists have investigated some of the like specific environmental effects and correlations to redlining. So there was a New York Times coverage of a couple of these studies about urban heat islands, which was published last summer. And what these, there's environmental scientists and economists kind of working together, what they illustrated is that redlined neighborhoods, and this is an example of outlines of the redlined neighborhoods in Richmond, Virginia, had, for example, fewer trees, fewer parks, less open and green space, and they had more kind of blacktop, impervious surfaces, and were basically unrelieved by any kind of like passive cooling elements or landscaping strategies, in part because these neighborhoods had been had not benefited from kind of equitable like tree planting or streetscaping efforts over the course of the 20th century, right? And so what these studies have illustrated, so you can see the illustration changes here. These are the redlined neighborhoods, and like simply like redder is hotter, and these are like the green line neighborhoods that were largely white, and bluer is cooler. right? So I said that there were some disparities within, we could think like, well, what's the difference, one side of town versus the other side of town? Well, these climate scientists have illustrated that there are, can be 10, 12, even 15-degree differences between two neighborhoods within the same city in the like on a single day over the course of a summer. Because of that tree canopy, because of the green space, park space, versus like really like impervious and like sun absorbing surfaces, right? And so you can see like this is a redlined neighborhood in Richmond, right, where it's basically like parking lots, brick buildings. There's a famed study by a sociologist of the Chicago heat wave of 1950. It's called, 1995. It's called Heat Wave by Eric Kleinenberg, and he illustrates, even before we really kind of knew about redlining, he's like, these neighborhoods are so hot that you can't get cool in them. They don't cool off overnight because the sun is beating down on them all the course of the day, and so they start out hotter even the next morning in the course of a heat wave that may last a week or 2 weeks. And that inability to cool off at night is kind of what leads to like scores and hundreds of deaths, as in that heat wave that he studies. Versus let's see, you can see they've mapped like tree cover, right, where there's very little tree cover in these redlined neighborhoods, right? There's no streetscaping, there's no parkland, but in these kind of green line neighborhoods, we see like wide array and options of like tree canopy and park space and so forth. And so that's kind of an evocative illustration of Richmond, but their work, Vivek Chandas and Jeremy Hoffman have illustrated this in basically cities throughout the country. I should say they used the resources that we make available through Mapping Inequality. So any city that you're interested in, Birmingham, Alabama, you can get like the maps that we digitized from the National Archives, for example. Whether you're interested in just a JPEG, whether you're interested in like a shapefile, you use GIS or you use GeoJSON, like all of the cities. So basically they downloaded this data and said, well, let's compare, let's compare these redlined neighborhoods using the shapefiles and so forth to census information that we have available from the federal government, as well as their kind of systematic temperature taking and heat assessments in cities across the country. And so what we see is that redline neighborhoods are more susceptible and they suffer more from the kind of heating aspects of climate change, but not only. There's also redline neighborhoods. There's several other studies which illustrate that redline neighborhoods are more susceptible to flooding. In many cases, they're in neighborhoods which were traditionally known as the flats or the bottoms, basically where drains, we can imagine like the wealthy factory owners who lived at the top of a hill looking down on their factory, and the workers housing around it. And so when there are massive rains, for example, rainwater, stormwater heads downhill and goes to, for example, the basements of houses and apartment buildings in redline neighborhoods. By the same token, the like sewer pipes, whether within a building or kind of like leading up to the public pipes, leading up to a building, are less frequently replaced and like have problems. They spring leaks, they break, or get backed up more often in redlining neighborhoods. So even where there's climate change leads to greater rainfall, and we've got throughout the Midwest patterns the last couple weeks this summer of massive rains. And those go to redlined neighborhoods. They suffer more for some of the same reasons. And I'll say, in many cases, those, redline redlining and the work of Holk and FHA, like they didn't create racism. They didn't create or mean that African Americans could only afford to live, for the most part, in these neighborhoods that were like the bottoms or that did not have parks and open space. But what they did was they took local discriminatory practices and they made national federal policy with the power of the federal government behind it, and then taught the private sector how to follow those rules. And I'll finish up by saying, illustrating what some of the legacy of this is in terms of public health. Another project from this is Mapping Inequality as part of a broader set of projects at the University of Richmond, and I partnered with staff at the University of Richmond to kind of do some of this work. But what they've done is illustrated that that a number of like neighborhoods in, let's close that. Neighborhoods that started out, were rated green or like the best neighborhoods, have largely remained that way. And not only through kind of like social vulnerability indices, that's kind of a conglomeration of public health and economic and educational attainment, kind of pulled together into a single evaluation or a comprehensive evaluation. So they continue for the most part, while redlined neighborhoods often like stay at the same, kind of like low level, like only in rare instances do they kind of get ahead. I'll say Denver has a couple of like key exceptions. Like this is a neighborhood that's basically kind of the same status now as it was in the 1930s, but there are a handful of, say, like yellow neighborhoods where now they're like some of the best and most desirable, and we see this kind of process of gentrification, not because the people who lived in that neighborhood were well treated, but basically because they were displaced, or that they there was like neighborhood succession. As people moved out, then more affluent people moved into neighborhoods with like desirable buildings that have like good bones, and they fixed it up and basically drew on these patterns of investment that were not available to African Americans. But let's say some of this like North Denver neighborhoods, what you can see is that this neighborhood, which was redlined in the 1930s, is like one of the highest percentage minority, even still, has some of the lowest life expectancy across the city or the metropolitan region, has like some of the like highest levels of poverty, 20% in this neighborhood now, like as of the most recent, not the 2020 census, but the American Community Survey and so forth, suffer from like some of the highest levels of problems like asthma, as well as diabetes, as well as high blood pressure, as well as kidney disease and so forth. In many cases, because of these environmental effects. Say we can easily imagine that, like the location of factories or the location of, like interstate highways or high traffic roads could deteriorate air quality, which would contribute to asthma, as well as things like high blood pressure and diabetes, which would come about in part because of many of these redline neighborhoods are food deserts, where they don't have access to, say, farmers markets or fresh produce, and they have like highly processed, highly salted, or highly like sugary, long-term, convenience store type of food, right? Rather than the kind of the full range of like fresh and healthy food, as an example. But so one of the things that's actually interesting is that many of these redline neighborhoods have some of the lowest levels of cancer, and that's largely because people would die of something else before, like cancer in many cases emerges later in life. Many times residents of redline neighborhoods die of something else before they did or would have developed cancer. But so through these kinds of tracking these kinds of data and kind of assessing these neighborhoods, we can see the kind of ongoing influence of redlining in a wide variety of environmental, like climatological, as well as public health measures. And, you know, I think it's something that you all have the question of, like, what can we do now, or what can our response be as we work to improve like environmental conditions, or we address risks of climate change? Like, how can we do that equitably? And I think, you know, organizations like this are kind of key, because like you have a chance to like debate policy, or kind of like brainstorm or develop collaborations, maybe in a way that you don't have like if you're working specifically in like a private sector position where you're, you know, you've got to like ship the product or something along these lines. And I would say through my research, my like broader research, certainly on redlining, like FHA and Holk officials, they went to the real estate appraisers organizations. They went to the American Banking Association, or American Bankers Associations, and those, the Building and Loan League organizations, to say, like, these are the new ideas that we have, and these are the new rules of the road for you know, for home finance and for real estate development. And, you know, like, just as over the long term, like professional organizations were part of the process of like building up these strictures and, you know, practices that were part of and then consequent to redlining. You know, it's really in many of these like kind of professional organizations or in these civic associations where some of the solutions, mitigating factors can be developed that can subsequently be implemented, right? Like, basically these kinds of organizations are like the think tanks and the idea generators that get adopted in public policy, or that can be brought to, you know, like the places that you work. I'll say that's enough for now. I'd be happy to take questions, and I'd also be happy to talk about like how, as you develop, right, like renewable energy plans, as well as you know, kind of like climate change responses, how to build in equity, whether using, right, like kind of like evaluations of redlining or broader considerations of equity.
LaDale, thank you. It's a very enlightening presentation, and also sobering and disturbing to a certain point as well. And I think those on the call here are familiar with the Denver neighborhoods, can see, you know, existing neighborhoods where this still exists.
Mm-hmm.
I want to share another, as the questions are starting to come in here, I want to share another slide here, or a local analysis that was done. So Denver's local analysis of what they call the inverted L, and
Mm-hmm.
you'll recognize some of these same areas here. The up here, the Globeville area, Swansea was prominent on your map.
Yeah.
Look at this edge here, this kind of curved line down here. This is where I-25, our highway, goes. So
Yeah.
our red lines were actually prolonged by the way the highways were installed through our city as well, and actually have kept these things in place for even longer, because you have that separation and you have the segregation that goes on with that. So this inverted L was actually, you know, started by redlining, prolonged by other categories, but is still here today. And you'll see both of these maps. The one on the left is pretty much a makeup by race of where people live, and that
Mm-hmm.
with your map that you showed. But the one on the right is where people are vulnerable to displacement because they can't afford to pay for the increase in home values and even pay their taxes as tax rates go up. So we're we're losing people out of these areas, and they're having to move hundreds of miles away just because the surrounding area has gone up in price. So we
Yep.
are, still suffering from that, and the city is working on that. The city is aware. This is actual city slides here that show this. I'll put a link in the chat that shows everyone this. So maybe LaDale, you could comment on what other cities are you seeing that have done a good job of addressing this? Are you starting to see results that we might find, or that we could copy or put similar programs in place?
So I'd first say that, like no city kind of has it perfect. Even the cities that we think of as like highly progressive and equity oriented have often left racial inequality out of the mix. So places like San Francisco, like Seattle, places in like Portland, Oregon, or cities in New England, even where they promote, they may have like strong working class communities, African Americans can be like left out of that equation, and especially in things like housing. And so what I would say is that it's not usually by city that I kind of advocate or talk about. It's usually by kind of topic or like specific program. So I will say, I've emphasized or focused on Richmond because like one of the climate scientists who work on the urban heat island is from Richmond, works there at a science institution, and works with a like basically an urban greening or urban forestry nonprofit that has like both a national and statewide. It's called Groundworks Virginia. Groundworks RVA is the local chapter. And what they do is they help cities develop like kind of urban forestry or urban greening plans. And so Richmond has definitely like actually taken on some of this, as a result of their work and their activism, planting much more like tree canopy and much more sensitive and equitable kind of landscaping, urban landscaping. The city of Chicago, which is like traditionally long-term one of the most segregated in the country, now has become like that metropolitan area because it has in part like 1/3 Black residents, 1/3 Latinx residents or citizens, and 1/3 white. There's kind of a much more equitable set of political discussions about where investments get made. And so the city of Chicago is in the process of developing, by the same token, like an urban like forestry, urban greenscaping program that emphasizes equity. Places like the city of Chicago have long had like lakeshore parks, which were available to African Americans, but on the lakeshore. And now the effort is to kind of green throughout the whole city. Places like Asheville, North Carolina, as well as Evanston, Illinois, outside of Chicago, have taken up the issue of reparations in some fashion. And this is like kind of an increasing movement. And what that means, depends city by city, whether it's like devoted to community institutions in like Black neighborhoods, or whether it's like specific housing investments. So I wouldn't say, like any city particularly like has it right. But what I would say is any community that has begun to promote equity and build it into infrastructure plans, as well as like recreational and environmental plans, is on the right track, because this is like 80 years in the making, and it will probably take sustained effort of 80 years, to kind of like undo, and that's optimistically speaking.
John, you want to ask that question? It's a little kind of continuation of what LaDale was just talking about.
Yep. So it's a question coming from David Kelly. He wants to know that given Denver's mayor and 10 other U.S. mayors have publicly advocated reparations for racial justice, looking to the future, what do you think the climate-oriented reparations could or should look like in Denver? And that again is from David Kelly.
So I'll say first, I am a novice. I don't want to present myself as an expert on like what these political negotiations specifically involve. But I would say that there has to be an ongoing, like a wide array of attempts, right? There's not one solution, and we don't need, like, I couldn't say, if you do it, this is what's going to happen, or like, this is what's going to be most beneficial, because this is like a process of policy experimentation, throughout, a wide array of communities. But I will also say that where we've seen like long-term patterns of investment or disinvestment inequalities, like those are some of the most important ones to undo or to rework. And so infrastructure, I think, is absolutely key. I mean, a matter of years ago, 3-4 years ago, like the eyes of the nation were on Flint, Michigan, because of its water crisis. And one of the key, factors was that there had been a long-term period of like disinvestment in the city of Flint in favor of kind of like suburban investment, like exurban investment. And so something as simple and quotidian as like sewer pipes, water pipes, getting these like more regularly removed, or like a long-term, say, like drainage plan, like that's not sexy, but that can be done either very equitably or very inequitably, and it's been done very inequitably for like 100 years. The regular work of like city government, county government, metropolitan government, I think like every single day we could be taking reparative and restorative and equitable measures, and there's improvements to be made like every single day. Like replace the sewer pipes or better drainage plan, like I said, not sexy in the least. Something like urban forestry, okay, like new parks, better schools in like Black neighborhoods or traditionally Black neighborhoods or Latinx neighborhoods, that's like a little bit more showy. That gives us a little bit more, kind of like pride, and I think also should be part of the solution because it helps build political will and political momentum. So I would say kind of a mix of some of these, like we'll say like underground or subsurface measures like infrastructure, like the hidden infrastructure, as well as some of these measures that are a little bit more showy infrastructure. And I'm very, very confident like any mayor, any county executive would much rather be at a ribbon cutting for, say, a new school or a new park or something like that than like a new set, like a set of like sewer pipes. But like both of those are like key elements to kind of these repairing these spatial inequalities.
No, that's awesome. So I guess moving on to the next question we just got, it's coming from Martin Volker. I'll read it verbatim. So you mentioned groundworks. There's a Groundworks Denver which provides energy efficiency services, which CRES has featured. They have problems finding participants to sign up for user-free energy upgrades because of deep-rooted mistrust, because it sounds too good to be true. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I'll say not specifically, but in general, I would say in any of these, like a part of equity-oriented activism, equity-oriented like functioning of city government is it's incumbent upon you know, it's incumbent upon like people within the program to do that kind of outreach, to do that kind of promotion, and to find the ways. And I understand that the problems and the challenges are multi-generational and are extremely difficult, but like these are solvable from, you know, in one sense, like if you have ambassadors, even like employees from the neighborhoods that you're trying, or from the communities that you're trying to reach out to, it's much easier to make the case. That can be a significant investment. Like it's much easier to say, we've got a program that, you know, like disadvantaged communities can take advantage of. You know, why aren't they coming? Or we've got a lot of problems kind of recruiting people. But hiring someone from that community, like into a key outreach, or into, right, like a regular role within your organization or within your program, is one of the best forms of outreach, of recruitment, and helps bridge and deal, even within an individual organization, some of these issues of equity. You know, like I'll put it bluntly, outreach from a white organization to, you know, like Black or brown communities is almost always going to be less effective than outreach from like a diverse and equitable organization to the communities that are represented in the company, in the organization. So like basically bringing people aboard the staff or in the program or in city government offices or so forth is, you know, can be key. And you've got to meet people where they are, even though I understand the challenges can be significant.
And I'll add on to there that along with when Martin was talking about Groundwork Denver is doing a lot of leading edge work there. They last year just completed a study and have a blueprint plan for Denver on what Denver needs to do. So I would encourage people to look that up. I apologize earlier, I was looking for that and was still sharing my screen. So sorry for the distraction of the flashing screen going across there. But if I find it here, I'll put it in the chat. But it's a great plan and really gives us some hope that there's people working on this and making a difference out there.
Awesome. So I think we just got another question. So this one's coming from Norvell Nelson. So as part of the atonement for the diesel assault on the U.S. was to provide services to the U.S. One of these was their establishment of Electrify America. This company was to supply VE charging stations for U.S. citizens. Not too surprisingly, Electrify America's first proposal showed that EV stations to fall outside of the traditional redlined areas. CA did force some changes, but VW's placement was clearly directed towards their anticipated electric vehicle purchasers. So how does one address redline issues when they are made by a private corporation? So I guess maybe to sum up, I know it's kind of hard through the grapevine. I think the question is really, you know, given kind of the use case of EV vehicles, and it looks like VW did a kind of a private corporate effective redlining, how do you address that when it's not a public entity doing those disproportionate allocations, and it's a private company?
Mm-hmm. So I'd say, you know, like I see like two possible venues, not the only two, but two that kind of come to mind. One is that in all of the kind of business recruitment, as well as like incentives, whether it be tax relief, in where communities and levels of government work to bring in new companies and investment, like equity should be part of those. You know, in some cases, there's like got to create like a certain number of jobs, right? Or there's clawbacks for like tax incentives. Like if equity is part of that, we know we might right now say, well, that's ridiculous. Like that's never going to be on the table. And it's not true. Like that is a matter of political will. And so I think we've seen kind of issues of racial equity become much more important just over the last handful of years in more significant in policy discussions. And so I can easily imagine like a future in which like business recruitment or incentives for these kinds of investments have equity requirements. Some of course already do. So like federal contracting and so forth has equity requirements, or minority hiring requirements. But so building that kind of like political will for whatever public policies like recruit and shape businesses. But then I would also say that I mentioned through trade associations and through organizations. I talk to banks, I talk to lenders, I talk to real estate professionals, and I also talk to civic organizations like Rotary clubs about this. And I'll talk to almost anybody, and many of my colleagues and collaborators will as well, because like people who are in these civic organizations or in these trade organizations, like also are managers or directors of corporations, whether it's their own kind of small private company or like larger metropolitan companies. And they can be and are receptive to this kind of education process and to these kind of civic debates. And I think they're more receptive to it in like trade organizations and in civic associations than they are in their role as a like manager or executive in a company, where they're like, I know exactly how to do this. I don't want to show like uncertainty, or don't want to change the formula that's brought success, unless they get this kind of influence, they get this education from some other source. And so I think in those kinds of trade associations, like those civic organizations, that's where we can do the education of people who are in like those kind of private corporations. That's a longer term mobilization answer, rather than what can we do. And I think it's for the most part it's not a matter of protesting at like the factory site or at the charging station or something along those lines. There can be outreach to journalists and so forth, but what I say when I talk to lenders and banks, they say like, this is horrible, and I can see the resonance in my contemporary work. What recommendation do you have for like when we like reject a loan, or when we accept someone or reject someone for a home mortgage? And I usually say, when it gets like, if you've got a yes or no answer at like that very last step of the process, that's not where the battle is won, right? It's in changing the culture of a corporation. It's in having recruitment and flow of applicants or equity considerations at a much higher level and much farther upstream. So then when you get to, like a kind of a desk worker who's like either accepting or rejecting a loan, like they've got to meet their, quotas or profit projections or whatever, to keep their job. That's not where the power lies. It's in these like much broader organizations, these much farther upstream efforts that can be extremely unsatisfying. But like that's where it happens. That's why I'm presenting on a Thursday night.
No, we really appreciate you doing that and spending time with us. We have one last question here. It's kind of an extension of a previous question, but it has specifically to do with planting trees. And I know that's always a big project, right? People see these areas, these heat islands, said, well, let's plant trees and stop the heat island. But this question is, what do you think about including businesses and using them for planting trees? This person has a business that presents to businesses about what they can do to help, and planting trees is one of their solutions. But what do you think about approaching businesses in these red line areas and including them in this?
I mean, I think the private sector always has been and always will be like part of these solutions, right? Whether it is, approaching, like private landowners, right? Whether they be institutional, whether they be landlords, or whether it be something like, like vacant lots that are on, like public tax rolls. Finding ways to work with like private businesses, private institutions to facilitate this, I think, is absolutely essential. And there's a number of ways to go about it, and it, like, in part, like these kind of broad civic conversations help shape, like, we used to talk about the Overton window. It shapes the bounds of discussion. And so, someone who 10 years ago would maybe never have said, like, yeah, let's talk about photovoltaic on my, like, building, or let's talk about planting trees, like on my property. Now I'll be like, okay, like the conversation has changed, and I'm much more open to this because they read about it in the newspaper all the time. They hear about it on the radio. They hear about it in their community, and it shapes the way, like their imagination, or it extends the limits of their like possibility. I would also say easily, I mentioned photovoltaic, like planting trees, like we can easily imagine how that happens, right? We're like, okay, great. So you got a sapling, you got a hole, you got to like have a bit of a, like evaluation of the microclimate and of the soil. We put it in the hole, we water it, everybody goes home a hero. We know what that kind of looks like. I could easily imagine when the establishment of, like, or increase of photovoltaic capacity or of wind generation capacity is like somewhat more technical, somewhat more challenging, and more difficult to envision, but can also be, I think, like achieved in an equitable fashion, right? Like kind of small scale. And I live in Charlottesville now, a small town. I work in Blacksburg, another small town, each of which has like pro solar nonprofits. And they have figured out ways to do like very small arrays, basically rooftop. And so, convincing, having outreach to, like, say, private landlords for the installation of, like small scale photovoltaic arrays in neighborhoods or places that have, that were redlined or that would address equity considerations, I think could be part of that. Whether it, alleviates reduces the electric bill in like a building, or for individual consumers in that, who rent in that building, or whether it's used for like a community institution, right? Like everybody, these 4 landlords have agreed to photovoltaic, and it's going to fund, or it's going to, like be used to support, like the building in this nearby public park, right? Like we could imagine, some kind of organization or some kind of recruiting like that. It happens like tediously. It happens with like a good deal of outreach, a good deal of education. But by the same token, it's not just trees, although those would be an important part. But it can be all of these kind of environmental and climatological responses that you're considering in Denver, and that we're considering in cities across the country.
Great. And then I think this will be our last question, but it's a doozy here in regards to gentrification. So, and I'm going to paraphrase some of this just to put it in some different words, is gentrification is people having to leave because of the appreciation in home prices and other prices of goods. But it seems like those communities could benefit from rising home values. Do you see any policies that will enable them to realize those benefits without having to leave those markets? And I would just explain a little further, as usually it's because of the increasing tax rates and other expenses, utility bills, that all rise together with those home prices that price people out of the market. But what do you see out there that might help people to get around that or be able to stay there even as their home price rises?
Mhm. So, I started with, I mean, this is basically like redlining is about like urban planning and like home ownership policy. And I went to graduate school and have a master's of urban planning. And all we talked about was zoning and master plans, all we talked about. And, like I absolutely still fundamentally believe that equitable, like master planning and like city land use um, is part of the equation, and particularly important for issues like of displacement and gentrification, because like if there are, we know, and I talk about, when we think about cities like Davis, California, that are like renowned, like environmental communities, and but they won't allow like large multifamily housing, options, right? They're like basically very environmentally friendly for the people who already live there or who can afford to live there for the next 20 years. And so equitable like real estate policies and like urban planning with particular respect to multifamily housing, apartments, and reducing the reliance upon single family zoning and other kind of exclusionary measures, I think is an absolute part of that. Because in many of these neighborhoods that are gentrifying, right? Like, as you say, they benefit from rising home values, rising, property values that create more taxes to be able to be invested. That has to happen, or the way to balance, reduce the effects of gentrification are to allow more people to enjoy the fruits of those rising property values. And, people have traditionally said like, no, like basically rich people who gentrify an area will never live next to, like large multifamily housing or next to a neighborhood of poor people. And, while that's like often true, we don't know that that won't happen without like the support of public policy. Like the way, like that's never been, it's been rarely tried because we have exclusionary zoning policies and we have these forms of like public input and public veto that prevent upzoning and densification of these neighborhoods. So I would say like equitable land use policy and processes like, or like mechanisms like upzoning, greater density, can be part of the equity issue, can be part of the environmental issue, and can mitigate some of these tensions and problems of gentrification, either in an individual neighborhood or across a metropolitan area. Like basically we say, Denver's built out, what are you gonna do? Like we know what's going to happen, and it'll be unlivable for a large proportion of the population 20 years from now. If people in Denver say like, we understand that this is the desirable community and that real estate property is like real estate prices are rising, how can we make this accessible to more with, we'll say, simple measures like accessory dwelling units, or upzoning, or the an easier path to multifamily housing and rental housing in particular can certainly be part of that.
No, great. I think that's a good note to follow up on. I think it's good advice for us, and I think we're seeing a lot of those differences here in Denver, and people having to adjust to this and decide whether they want to stay or not. I'm putting a couple things in the chat right now. I repeated our email there, so if you give us feedback at that email address, it'd be great to know if this was a good topic tonight, what you thought of that and how we should do. I want to thank LaDale for his time on a Thursday night to do that. I do want to jump to a slide though that I missed. I think it's very important tonight. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. It's just one slide here to show you this announcement from Excel. So if you don't have Excel or you're in a shared energy type arrangement. You probably don't know about this, but Xcel has filed a new rate case to raise our electricity bills, but it's pretty hefty. It's a 13% increase. They're also looking to raise their rate structure to change the amount of profit they get. And we don't have that in here, but it's another part of it. But we would encourage you, if you have feelings about this, to contact the PUC, and you can file there. The rate case is this number at the bottom, the 21 AL 0317E, and you can see the complicated title of that. But we all have an opportunity to affect this and to get our opinions in it. So as a renewable energy group, we feel that this is an important topic for us to discuss, and we'll probably bring it up more in the legislative session in the future as well. Just to give you some history on this, in the past, they've tried for these, and the PUC has cut both the rate amounts and the profit amounts for Xcel and not let them put these huge increases through. But each time we don't know what's really going to go on there.
Mm-hmm.
So, and LaDale, any comments on there? I mean, this is a type of gentrification, right, of the energy prices going up on people in wealthy neighborhoods or wealthy metro areas like Denver is.
Yeah, and as I said about like infrastructure, like the nuts and bolts of governance and equity, like many cases, there's nothing sexy about it, like debating rate increases or like what this goes for, what the regulatory requirements are for like how much profit and what that is used for, what are allowable, say like lobbying or outreach or requirements for civic investment, right? Like that takes a lot of work, a lot of journalism, a lot of study in order to like make sure that the revenue that we raise or like the infrastructure that we have like actually serves our community values.
Great, thank you. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. Thanks everyone for your time. We've had almost all of our attendees stay till the very end here. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you next month on our legislative panel. With that, thank you again, LaDale.